Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you to Christina. It's very nice to be here. As Lisa mentioned, I was here 2 years ago. I lived in Berkeley, so I'm happy to be back. I'm happy to be making connection with the PowerPoint, with old and new friends.
I think you do.
Do we switch around? Okay.
Better not to ask.
Right. Slide view is, I'm not a Mac person.
You can hit the little button at the bottom, the little picture of the slide.
Oh, yeah.
Just like the other. Yeah, that one. Yeah, everything's just on the right.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Yeah, it's really good to be here, and thank you all for coming out on such a warm and gorgeous day. I want to share with you the work that I've been involved with for the last, I guess almost a decade now. And in talking about that, I want to talk about the broader work that I've done over the last 18 years with undocumented youth. I first became acquainted with this population of kids who come to this country without legal status and grow up here in the early 90s. Right after college, I moved to Chicago and started out as a youth worker and then ran a community center in the near northwest side of Chicago in a neighborhood that was mostly Mexican and also Puerto Rican and Polish. I ran programs for kids. We had kids ages 5 through 18 in different programs. I lived 4 blocks from the community center where I worked and was definitely a part of the day-to-day life of the community. Over the years, we noticed that a lot of our kids, a lot of the neighborhood kids, a lot of the kids who were in the center were running into dead ends because of legal status. At school, within the community, and a lot of our program kids were getting really frustrated. Many of which were dropping out of school because there were very few answers in the community. This is early 90s. The high schools in those communities, graduation rate, like many urban high schools, right around 50%. And a lot of adults in the community that didn't know what to do with these students who didn't have legal status. A smaller number of these students were going all the way through their senior year and trying to get into college, but not having the answers, right? No in-state tuition at the time, and very few scholarships for these students. So I want to tell you about a boy named Alex that I knew for 10 years. So I met Alex when he was 7. He was in one of my after-school programs, and we noticed right away that Alex was very talented. Alex kept to himself most of the time, sitting in the corner and drawing. And so we poked and prodded Alex and encouraged him over the years to pursue his talent, this obvious talent of his in the arts. Buying paints and pencils and other materials for him along the way, paying for classes. And so Alex, by the time he was in 8th grade, had been a major part of 3 murals in his community. And people were saying this kid is really talented. And so our goal for Alex was to get him into this art school, the Chicago Academy for the Arts, private arts high school in Chicago. We fundraised enough money to pay for his first year tuition. Alex was ready to go, excited. His parents were on board. Yes, he's still going to learn kind of basic math and English, but this is a specialty school. So everybody was on board. Alex was really excited to go to the school, and Alex took home the application. So we started going through the application and saw on the application space for 9 digits, right? So space for his social security number. Alex had never had to deal with this in his young life. And so he went to his mom and said, Mom, I'm filling out my application, I need your help. What is my social security number? And that conversation is a tough conversation that his mom had to have with him, that over the years, as I've met more and more students, that a lot of students talk about, is that conversation with their parents when they realized they did not, in fact, have legal status. Alex's mom told me he didn't have legal status, and Alex was frustrated and didn't know what to do with this information. So we took it to the school. Here's this kid's portfolio. He's certainly competitive, and we think that he has a good shot at getting into the school. We were told immediately that Alex was an illegal immigrant, and because he was an illegal immigrant, that he couldn't gain acceptance into the school. So Alex went from very high hopes to the neighborhood high school, Wells High School. As I mentioned earlier, graduation rate at Wells was about 50% of the time. Alex was frustrated. He was disconnected with teachers, and started in the fall at Wells High School. Alex soon learned that he couldn't take driver's ed because, as an undocumented immigrant, he could not drive in the state of Illinois. His friends were going out and playing video games, and his parents didn't have a lot of money to give him extra money, to give him spending money, so he wanted a job. And he realized also that he could not take a job. So one by one, barriers were erected in front of Alex. Right? And suddenly his world changed really overnight. Sadly, Alex didn't make it past his first semester of school. Started hanging out with young people, other young guys who were out of school and on the street. Alex's life ended at 16 years old. And in the time after that, I spent a lot of time really scratching my head and asking myself these really difficult questions. One, what happened in this young man's life to send his life spiraling downward so quickly? And two, for those of us who cared about him, for those adults who were in his life, where did we go wrong? So these questions motivated my study. Fast forward a couple of years, I'm in Southern California, and I'm meeting in the city of Santa Ana. People know Santa Ana in Orange County, the largest city in Orange County. Santa Ana Unified is about 92% Latino, high 80% low income. So I started meeting young adults just like Alex. Same situation, had come to the United States as children, did not have legal status, and as they moved through adolescence and young adulthood, started realizing the limitations of their lives changing almost completely 180 degrees. And that motivated my study, and that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about today. So, over the last year especially, the DREAM Act movement has really shed light on this population of young people like Alex. Right? Those who come to the United States without legal status, grow up here, go through our schools, and find out that to participate in adult life in the United States, not having legal status really hinders their ability. However, while there is a bit known, and during some news cycles, almost every day there's a story on undocumented youth, the academic community knows very little about these young people, right? The academic community knows much less about about the counterparts of these DREAM Act students who don't end up on college campuses, right? And so that's what I want to talk about today. Just to give some context, about a third of all immigrants today are undocumented, an estimated 11.1 million. Children, those who constitute the 1.5 generation, I want to be very clear, when people talk about undocumented youth, there are a lot of different definitions. And so really I'm looking at those who come to this country before the age of 14, right? So receive a lot of their schooling and socialization in the United States, right? If we look at this population, the best estimates that we have, there are about 1.1 million who are under the age of 18, and then an additional million of these young people who are now young adults. Right? If people have been paying attention to these stats, largely by the Pew Hispanic Center, this number has shrunk, right? So if we pay attention to the number of undocumented children, this number has shrunk, but the reality is that a lot of these kids are moving into adulthood, which is really important to know. And so given this demographic reality, really necessitates a focused attention to this 1.5 generation undocumented young people, youth and young adults. So I was in Europe a couple of years ago, and I went to a conference with this title, Undocumented Youth in Europe, Invisible Victims of Immigration Restriction. And this is a frame that we don't use here in the United States so much, right? A lot of the conversation, a lot of the debate is around access to higher ed. But I want to look at this a little more broadly. And so many scholars have argued that changes in our immigration policies over the last 2 to 3 decades, right? A tightening of the border, stiffer penalties for those who get caught, have really transformed once circular migration patterns, right, whereby single migrants who left families back home would come back and forth, would work for a few months and then go back to their countries of origin. And here I'm really talking about Mexico in particular, right? So the work of Doug Massey, Wayne Cornelius, and others really argue that it's become a lot more expensive, a lot more difficult, and a lot more dangerous to cross, right? And so instead of making multiple trips, is that migrants have sent for their families. And so what we've seen over the last couple decades, right, after IRCA, the undocumented population was right around 3 million in this country. And so in 20 years, we saw this number increase fourfold, right, to almost 12 million in 2008. Right? And so what does this mean is that we're really looking at, for the large part, a very new population, relatively, that's really about the unintended consequences of our immigration and more specifically, border policies. And so what we see are increasing numbers of women and children who are making their homes here in this country. So here's a dilemma. In 1982, the Supreme Court ruled in Plyler versus Doe that undocumented children have the right to receive a K-12 education here. But our laws have not sorted out what happens to them as they grow older. So while they can attend school, they can't legally drive in most states, right? They cannot receive financial aid, they can't vote, right? And so most activities that define adulthood are out of limits. And so our laws treat children and adults differently, but they don't account for children becoming adults. They don't account for a continuity along the life course. As a result, tens of thousands of undocumented children graduate from high school each year with uncertain futures. And so here's a research project. I'm interested in engaging a couple of literatures in particular. That on immigrant incorporation and the work on segmented assimilation that's been done over the last decade or so, and some of the work by Mary Waters and folks on the East Coast, and Porter and Rumbaut, their children in the immigrant longitudinal study, a large LA study by Rumbaut and Bean and others. And also this scholarship on illegality. Essentially, the scholarship on immigrant incorporation has moved away from a singular focus of human capital to look at the importance of context, right? To look at the importance of historical and structural context in the lives of immigrants and their